My name is Phil Rutherford. I'm the former senior manager of radiation safety at the Santa Susana Field Lab at Boeing. Been retired about 8 years, and I recommend retirement. Let's go to the next slide here. Okay. Last year at the Spokane meeting, I described the nuclear decommissioning program at the Santa Susana Field Lab. I described the legislation and the litigation and the regulatory abuse by one agency and the regulatory inaction by another agency. And all this was led by activists, of course, politics and LNT-based radiation paranoia. One of the last topics that I described was the agreement by DTSC, that's the Department of Toxic Substances Control in California, which actually is the regulatory agency for hazardous waste management rather than radioactive materials. They have since basically taken over responsibility for regulating radioactive materials and the decommissioning, certainly at Santa Susana. And I think maybe Ken will be talking a little later on about how that is spilt over to the rest of California. So the final topic that I discussed there was DOE and DTSC's agreement that all demolition debris from decommissioned facilities that have been released for unrestricted use, and also demolition debris from non-radiological facilities should be sent to Energy Solutions and managed as low-level radioactive waste, even though surveys had shown, obviously, that they were either indistinguishable from background or had met decommissioning cleanup standards. So what this presentation does is a follow-up, basically, to show how that demolition debris was falsely characterized. So to step back a little bit, Area 4 of Santa Susana had been used since the 1950s for nuclear research for the Department of Energy, liquid metal research specifically, liquid metal cooled nuclear reactors, liquid metal research in general. So what you see here is what the site looked like in 1985. There were upwards of 270 facilities supporting that work. It's about approximately 300 acres in size, and there's about 1/10 of the size of the whole Santa Susana. This is just Area 4. So this is what it looked like in 2019. Now, what is highlighted here are a variety of facilities owned by the Department of Energy, which were demolished over the last several years. Some of the buildings in the foreground are owned by Boeing, and I'll speak about those a little later on. So what you see here, circled here, is a radioactive material handling facility in building 4024, which was a SNAP reactor building. These had not been decommissioned. They were being torn down, and obviously material from these buildings was low-level radioactive waste and would be disposed as such. However, the issues are these other buildings here, 4029, 4019, 4133, which had gone through the decommissioning process and been released for unrestricted use. And then a third set of buildings here, 4057, 4038, the sodium pump test facility, which were non-radiological buildings and had no history of radiological use. Nevertheless, they had also been surveyed according to MARSIM and shown to be indistinguishable from background. Building 4038 actually happened to be an office building that I spent almost 8 years in back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Notice the large building here, the sodium pump test facility. We'll see that in the next couple of slides. So in 2020, the DTSC and the DOE signed an order of consent whereby the DOE agreed to dispose of these decommissioned facilities and also facilities with no history of radiological use. They agreed that they would send all that debris to Energy Solutions in Clive, Utah, as low-level radioactive waste. In fact, in a public Zoom meeting, during the discussion of this, one of the DTSC officials said that buildings with a history of radiological use, regardless of their status of unrestricted release or decommission, was sufficient enough to say that the waste could be, and indeed would be, characterized or classified as low-level radioactive waste. They used, one of their favorite phrases was that out of an abundance of caution, they would dispose of this clean and regulated debris as low-level radioactive waste. When asked for a legal or regulatory citation for this, we were met with silence. So out of an abundance of caution, all this material goes as low-level radioactive waste. Now, this is the sodium disposal facility. Some of the walls have been taken down, but this was the last facility to be demolished. Hopefully you can hear this. So even though all that material was intended to be sent as low-level rad waste, and indeed the public were told that, nevertheless they threw caution to the wind and blew the whole thing up. This obviously resulted in a furor in the local community and the local media. How on earth can you possibly blow up a facility that you are disposing of low-level rad waste without any dust suppression, obviously? So a month after that, in November 2021, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to the DOE asking for all the characterization data and documentation for all this building debris. In particular, I asked for the Energy Solutions Form radioactive waste profile and the NRC 5441 uniform low-level radioactive waste manifests, with the intent, because I was curious how they were going to actually characterize this material as rad waste when it had been surveyed as clean. So about a year later, I received a reply, and they provided much of that information. I reviewed it very closely, and several months later, I sent in an 18-page critique of what they had provided. I sent it to the whole management chain in a DOE, both the local ETEC management, the DOE EM1, Secretary of Energy, Northwind, who were the contractors for DOE, who were doing the demolition, and Energy Systems, and also DTSC. And basically, to summarize, they used a very limited set of survey data from the contaminated buildings, and they used that to characterize other decommissioned buildings and also the buildings with no history of radiological use. You'll see later on what I mean by limited. None of the documentation, none of the waste profiles or waste manifests named any building or any building numbers, so it was impossible to distinguish between which building the waste came from. And that was obviously an intent to mask the source of the waste. Manifest radionuclide concentrations were inconsistent and very different from the waste profile concentrations. And containers with significantly different weights had identical radionuclide activities, which obviously is physically impossible. And also multiple containers with identical radionuclide activities had identical waste weights. So I sent this letter to all these folks in January, and we'll see later on by the response that I got. So the limited characterization data that I was talking about was one, and I'll repeat, one maximum upper bound scan surface contamination alpha beta measurement from a contaminated building. This was taken in 2007, a long time ago. Northwind didn't even bother to use any current data, and 3 wipe tests, of which they did isotopic analysis. When asked for these particular wipe tests and the results, we didn't receive any response at all. These were undated and undocumented. So again, these were used to characterize, clean, and decommission facilities. So the waste profiles, those of you who've sent waste to energy solutions should recognize this. This is where one specifies the upper bound concentrations and the average concentrations of the various radionuclides. There are 5 waste profiles that were provided. This is the first one. And again, all 5 waste profiles use the identical limited data set. All profiles have different sets of concentrations. So how these concentrations are derived, we don't know. We weren't told by DOE, even though we asked. How did surface contamination become volumetric contamination? We don't know. This is the second waste profile. And again, this is highlighted because when one looked at all the 400 and so waste manifests, 405 of the 408 manifests use this waste profile, 732-02. So again, there are I think 11 radionuclides here. Now the next profile, again, using the same data, somehow adds a mysteriously additional 13 additional radionuclides. How come all these different profiles exist from the same set of data? This next waste profile, only 2. This happened to be non-aqueous oil. And notice the very high concentrations of tritium and cesium. The next profile, again, a large number of radionuclides, similar to the previous large set, except that they've added the potassium-40 for some reason, and all the concentrations of potassium-40 are much less than that in regular dirt and contaminated dirt. So we see here that looking at this set of radionuclides, the weighted average concentration, which was specified for waste stream 7332-02, you can compare those with EPA-derived background threshold values for soil here, and for all except cesium and plutonium and strontium, everything was less than background threshold values for soil. Looking at the manifests, I mentioned that there were 400, and many multiple containers have identical total activities, yet have vastly different weights. This is obviously impossible. The standard way is to take the concentration values from the profiles multiply them by the weight of the waste and derive activities. They did it the other way around. They took activities which, where did the activities come from? Who knows? And divided by the weight and derived concentrations. That is not the way it should be done. And as I say, many single container manifests had identical weights and identical activities, physically impossible. Now let's look at some specific examples here. What we're looking at here again is two separate manifests with two containers each. So the vertical column here is a shipment from July 2020 containing two containers. This next one, about a week later, is the second shipment, again containing two containers. Notice the highlighted numbers here. 0.044861 millicuries for all three containers, even though the weight of the containers is vastly different. 3,900 kilograms, actually the weight of the waste rather than the container, 8,208 kilograms and 3,500 kilograms. Vastly different weights with identical radionuclide concentrations, not only for the total, but also for the individual radionuclides, a physical impossibility. Similar thing here, again, looking at two separate shipments, in this case, single roll-off containers in each shipment. And again, the same identical total activity of 0.044. Vastly different weights, 16,000 kilograms, 10,000 kilograms. I mentioned that the waste profiles and the various different concentrations from the manifests are all different. This just summarizes the difference. And then, as I mentioned before, a whole series of different shipments here. We've got 16 or 17 or so different shipments here, starting from 0.214 to 0.240. All of these have the same weight, 10,000 kilograms, the same activity. And notice the seven significant figures of accuracy here. How on earth can all these different waste containers weigh exactly the same? Obviously, they can't. Similar situation down here. So, the DOE public relations, they were very proud of their milestone here. They basically demolished their final DOE-owned buildings, certainly a major milestone. However, what is omitted is more significant. They only took down the surface structures. So both the RMHF, the SNAP building 4024, SNAP buildings 4019, all have subsurface reactor vaults, which are activated. These removal actions will be obviously more complex. So you can't fight City Hall. Well, I've been trying to do that for the past 6 months. The original letter that I sent to DOE highlighting all these inconsistencies and falsification of data, I sent in January. I sent them to all the management chain involved in the different organizations. Zero response from anybody. It's like it went into a black hole. 1 month later, I again sent letters to both the Utah Division of Waste Management and Radiation Control. Again, they're the ones who license Energy Solutions. I sent the information also to the DOE Inspector General. No response. Well, acknowledgement of receipt, but no specific response to the allegations. Wait another 2 months or so into April. No specific response. So I sent them another email. Finally, I find that, Utah does have a complaint number. Also, the DOE Inspector General has a complaint number, which are these. The next couple of slides, I'll kind of discuss both of those a little. The Utah Division of Waste Management, they actually sent me a letter May 16th, and they stated that Energy Solutions had not violated its license and it had not accepted low-level radioactive waste exceeding Class A limits. And therefore, they consider the case closed. Now, of course, that was not the issue at all. That was not the allegation. So I called them and explained all this in the telecon, and they acknowledged that they really hadn't looked at the details of the allegation and are committed to take a second look and to specifically address the allegations of the falsified manifests. As of today, we're still waiting a response. The DOE Inspector General, of course, they invite reports of fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement, which this obviously was. However, the Inspector General is much harder to speak to and less transparent than Utah. All attempts to communicate with them are fruitless. And the only information you can get from them basically is whether the complaint or the case is still open or closed. I was told that it is still open. However, as of today, after 5.5 months, no information about what their conclusions or findings are. Now we're doing the time here. Sidestep a little bit here. Many of you are probably familiar with the old DOEG 441.1-XX control and release of property with residual radioactive material. That was drafted way back in 2002. Recently, March of this year, DOE issued the final version of this. Finally, after 21 years, they changed the title and they changed the number. It's a DOE Standard 1241/2023, implementing release and clearance of property requirements. In that, they basically say, hey, we DOE will follow pretty well the traditional release criteria using the NRC 25 millirem per year plus LLRW for real property, 1 millirem per year for personal property. Surface contamination limits, we'll use the same ones as Reg Guide 1.86, even though Reg Guide 1.86 has been removed, albeit NRC still use those numbers. Volumetric contamination limits will be based on ANSI N 1312. And for radium-226 in surface sulfide picocuries per gram, same as UMTROCA. Nowhere in the standard is there any mention of LNT-based risk levels, 10⁻⁶, limits, clean up to background, or out of an abundance of caution. So obviously the local ETEC, DOE management are not kind of in communication with DOE headquarters in terms of how it handles radioactive waste, or indeed decommissioned material or clean material. One other thing that I mentioned in my paper last year was the lawsuit by Physicians for Social Responsibility, Committee to Bridge the Gap, and various other activist organizations who are opposing Boeing's plans to demolish Boeing-owned facilities, which had been decommissioned long ago, claiming that we'd be sending waste to facilities not licensed to accept waste, low-level waste. Okay, so 5 years ago, the court found for the defendants, namely DTSC, DPH, and Boeing. Of course, the plaintiffs appealed, and just recently, the appeals court, after 10 years, came out and again supported the defendants, saying that any decommissioned, released for unrestricted use and removed from a license, whether it not be NRC or the state, was no longer considered a regulated radioactive material and cannot be arbitrarily alleged to be low-level radioactive waste. By implication, needs not to be sent to a low-level rad facility. It's ironic that the DTSC, the regulatory agency, who was actually one of the defendants in this lawsuit, actually violated the court's decision by ordering DOE to send clean waste and decommissioned waste and material to Energy Solutions. I won't read all this summary, it basically just repeats what I said, but the last two issues here, these views are my views alone. I'm retired now. They do not represent the views or opinion of my previous employer, the Boeing company. And indeed, Boeing terminated its contract with the Department of Energy, which it had had for the last 60 years, in September 2014, 1 year before I retired, and was not a party to the DOE building demolition program described here. And obviously, this material has not been approved by DOE and DTSC. Additional material can be seen here. Anyone wanting a copy of this this briefing, of which there are many online links, can give me a call or email me. I think I'm right out of time. Apologies for that. Any time for some questions?
Nope. No questions?
No questions? Okay. I just hope that no one in the audience has to sit through or has to experience this kind of regulatory abuse.